I am joined by Cassidy, who has published over 40 novels of crime fiction. I have read 6 of your books. Did you always know that you wanted to be an author? Because I saw online that you did actually used to be a teacher.
Yes, not really, no. I was a teacher for a long time, but I was an English teacher, so I got into books in a big way. And, when you love reading books, there was a little bit of me that said, I wonder if I could write a book.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you get that voice in your head that says, don't be ridiculous, of course you can't. But nonetheless, I gave it a try. And I managed to get my first novel published because I was teaching teenagers at the time. It seemed like a good thing to write for them.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a book that was kind of like an adult book, but about teenagers. And so a murder mystery seemed perfect. And that started me off on that particular road. And then I just kept publishing one after the other. And obviously it's absolutely been lovely. But I love a murder mystery book. So that's the kind of stuff I've written.
How long did it take you to write your first book and get it published? Was it a long process trying to shop your book around a lot, or not really?
Well, it took me about a year to write it, and amazingly, I wrote it on an old typewriter in 1990, 89, 90, and I sent it off to, I didn't have an agent, so I sent it off to 3 publishers, and the 3rd publisher accepted it. So I was very, very lucky. About 6 months it took. And then I wrote a second book, which was accepted, but the 3rd book was turned down. And that's when I got an agent and a different publisher. So that was my journey.
Because you've published your books with quite a few different publishers, haven't you? You've gone for different ones over the years.
Yes, I've had quite a wide experience, and that's been lovely. I've worked with all sorts of people, and that gives you a different insight into what you're writing. Yeah. Because obviously your editors are the second people to read your book, and they all have different preferences and tastes and so on. So it gives your books different edges, if you like.
Yeah, your books are described as crime fiction, kind of YA crime fiction, but I have always said on my channel, like, I didn't read your books when I was a teenager. I've read them, the first one probably when I was about 20 years old, and I think they can be enjoyed by adults and teens. They're not just for teenagers, because they are just, there's great moral dilemmas. That's why I love in them, because you're thinking, oh, what would I do in this person's situation? And also, I do like crime fiction, so I think they can be for teenagers and adults as well at the same time as well. I have read 6 of your books. I have read Love Letters, Guilt Trip, Missing Judy, Looking for JJ, Innocent, and Talking to Strangers. My favourite book from you is Looking for JJ. Do you have a favourite book that you've ever written?
Well, in a way, I suppose it also has to be Looking for JJ, because it was so successful. And it was actually my 17th book. And prior to that book, really nobody knew who I was in the children's book world. Librarians knew, but nobody else. And that book just changed everything for me, and it allowed me to write a lot more books. Yeah. I've recently been doing some slightly different things, and the last 2 books I published were in fact not murder mysteries, but were about rape. Can't quite get them in, but yes, they were about rape. So I've tried in a way to move on a little bit, because I don't want to be in danger of writing the same book over and over.
And they're published with hotkeys, aren't they?
They are hotkey, those 2 books, yeah. So it's hard when you've written as many books as I have to, I'm often drawn back to crime, and then I think, well, no, I'll try something a bit different. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Are you interested in true crime? Is that how it all started? Do you read a true crime case and then that inspires you in a story?
Yeah, most of my books come from real things that have happened in the world. My ideas are triggered by actual things. So, looking for JJ, of course, the killing by one child of another child, that is something that's been in the newspapers and been part of the national psyche in a way. But yeah, I usually look, the books I've written about rape, No Virgin and No Shame, these came from a lot of this stuff about girls being passed from one boy to another. This notion that if a girl was prepared to sleep with one boy, well, she was available for anyone else, regardless of what she thought of it. And that really got me down, reading case after case of that. Plus the whole business of young people using pornography and not really understanding that actually real life is not like pornography.
Yeah.
Pornography is a genre, just like Marvel is a genre.
Yeah, I find it frightening of children taking images of themselves and sending it to others, and that whole thing, because I didn't have that when I was younger. I'm 28, so we didn't have that kind of pressure to do anything like that. So it's a completely different kind of world for them now, I feel.
That's right. So I wanted to write a fairly explicit upfront book about rape, and it's not an easy read, but you know, you want to try some different things, really.
Yeah. Were you ever, with any of your books, because they are about teenagers, and did you teach English in a secondary school, I'm guessing?
I did. I taught English for 20 years.
Were you ever inspired by stuff you'd hear about the students themselves, some of their stories?
Yes, it's the characters really I get from students. Obviously I can remember my own teenage years. That very much was, those 5 years are a period of vast change and huge psychological development and agonies and anxiousness and so on. So the actual age range was perfect for me to write about. And of course, working with them day in and day out, I was I could work on friendship groups and the kind of things that they found difficult or the things they worried about. And when you're a teacher, you live and breathe that all day long. So it was very easy for me to write about teenagers for that reason.
Yeah, and the way they speak, they're so believable, the teenagers within your stories, and so you obviously picked up on the way they speak to each other and interact with each other, and peer pressure, which is a huge thing, and also a theme in some of your books that someone won't do something because they don't want to get in trouble with their friend, and how important friends are to teenagers, how that is your whole world, your circle group, and where you stand in the circle group. You must have seen that a lot as a teacher.
Well, to be honest, a lot of that knowledge came from my own teenage years, because although teenagers are very, on the exterior, they're different now. They're louder, they've got phones, they've got different things going on in their lives. In their hearts, I think they're just the same as I was when I was 14. I wanted a dear, close, loyal friend. I wanted to be respected. I wanted a bit more freedom from my parents. Now, I think probably any teenager I speak to now, today, will say those three things are really important to them. So, it's great working with teenagers, but actually you have to find your own teenager inside you to really get to grips with it, because that's where I can remember being heartbroken when my friends went off with someone else. And I don't belittle that in my stories, because I think that was huge to me. Not that much has changed, which is probably why me, a fairly old lady wearing Marks and Spencer's clothes, can write about teenagers, I think.
Yeah, no, I absolutely adore your books, and they reminded me of things that I'd almost forgotten when I was a teenager, like forgotten that when your friend gets a boyfriend, oh, you're kind of left out of the group all of a sudden. I'd forgotten about all those different things, because obviously you grew up and you get your own boyfriend and everything, but how heartbroken you can be with your best friend going off with someone else and then leaving you. With your two more recent books that you were talking about, are they a series?
Well, they are two halves of the same story. The first book, which is called No Virgin, is about the rape of a girl called Stacey. And the second book, which is called No Shame, is about the court trial and when the man is brought to court and what happens with that. So they're all about the same girl. They're not a series. They're just two halves of the same story. Interestingly, I think in some ways I wish I'd written the whole story and put it in one book. But I genuinely didn't think there was any more story after the end of the first book until it got published and people started talking about, well, what would happen if there was a trial and so on. So then that's where the second book came. In Italy, where this book has also been published, they've published them as the same book. So you've got the two halves in one edition, which I think is probably quite a good thing. But yeah, so they're both about Stacey and what happened to her and then what happens afterwards in the trial.
Okay. And a question that I just had is that you have had your books published with many different publishers and your books have completely different looks to them. So I have these editions that have the newspaper cut out, but then I also have an edition here that has a photograph cover, and then another one here has a completely different kind of heart print there. Do you have any say on the book covers, or is that just down to the publishers?
I don't have much say. Mostly I like my covers. I don't like all of them. The publishers have teams of people who work on what is going well in the shops, what the modern preference among readers is, and I have to allow them some leeway because they know their business. It's interesting you should say that because during lockdown I had a little project over on Instagram where I photographed and described nearly all of my book covers, right from my very first book in 1991, which was called Big Girl Shoes, and all the covers over the 30 years, are all very different. And I tried to explain in my captions what was happening with this cover, why it was chosen. There are quite a few of my books that have got two different covers, and I tried to compare them. So that might be something people who are interested in covers might like to go. But
I'll link down your Instagram down below so in the description people can go to that.
Sometimes you do come head on with a publisher because you don't like a cover, and it's not been my experience that I've ever won the argument in that situation. The cover usually goes ahead and you just have to live with it. But the book's still there, the story's still the same, but sometimes you just have to live with their choice.
Is the reason you said some of your books have been the same book but published with different covers, were they published with different publishers or were they just reprinted years later?
No, they were reprinted. Looking for JJ has been out for 2004, so it's been out for 16 years and it's had 3 different covers. And I'm hoping that Scholastic, lovely people that they are, might give it a new cover again because it still sells very well. But no, what happens in a publisher's is that they, at some point, they have a look at their books and some of them look a bit tired and sort of old-fashioned, and so they pick out the books that are still selling well and they decide to rejacket them, and that's a huge thrill for a writer to get a new cover.
Yeah. With Looking for JJ, you wrote another book in the series.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a kind of follow-on, didn't you? Why did you decide to follow on with the characters?
Mainly because I talk about that book when I visited schools ever such a lot, and students were very enthusiastic about it. It's got quite a bittersweet, a kind of sad ending, and a lot of students said to me, but what happened next to her? What happened in her life after that? And so after 10 years, when it was out, I decided to revisit it, and the book is called Finding Jennifer Jones. And the interesting thing about that is that book was published by a different publisher.
Oh, right.
And the 2 publishers liaised with the cover, so that if you see the newer cover of Looking for JJ and Finding Jennifer Jones, the covers look as if they've come from the same publisher, but in fact they're different. But it was lovely revisiting Looking for JJ, and I was pleased with how the book came out, and I was really pleased with the end too.
I also saw that Looking for JJ had been turned into a play. I saw online.
Yeah.
Was that true?
Yes, it was. It was in 2006, and it was on in London at London Bridge. I think I've forgotten the name of the theatre now, but it was a lovely play, brilliantly done with original music, not a musical, but had music in it. And, well, you can't get a bigger thrill than that, really, when you're a writer. But it seemed to touch people in a way that not that many books do. And I'm just privileged that happened. So
yeah, I think people are, because people often hear about children murdering other children, but then you don't hear. There's just something about this book where it's like you see behind the curtain of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You have the media circus, and that is in the book as well, but then you get to see the child who is the murderer, what actually happened, what actually was going through that child's head, and you get to see behind that, whereas we don't really get to see that at all. You just don't see it. And in the UK, obviously, people's names are protected, so we don't get a follow-up on what's happening to them. So I think that's why it's such an interesting book.
But that's the job of fiction, I feel, to sort of to recreate things perhaps, and try and work out what people might have been feeling, what pressures were there, because people aren't born bad.
Yeah.
People are born with as blank sheets of paper. Now, how can a 10-year-old child kill somebody else? What was going on in that child's life to make them or put them in that position? And I suppose that hadn't happened in our newspapers, and it seemed to me that somebody should try and imagine what might have gone on in that child's mind, and who better to do it than a writer of fiction.
Yeah.
And because I wrote for teenagers, and this story was everywhere about boys who had been released from prison after having done this heinous crime, it seemed like they would be a good audience for this. And it's interesting, when I spoke about it in schools, they were all shocked to bits when I told them the story of it. But when they'd read the book, they were confused. They wanted to dislike this girl. They wanted to hate her for what she'd done, and they couldn't. And I felt that maybe if it made them think a bit about it, then that was a good thing.
Yeah, I like, almost frightening though with your books, how things can get out of control very quickly. How people don't mean to do anything bad, but if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then you react in a bad way and you try and keep a secret. I think these books are great for anyone, adults and teens, but especially for teens, about when you try and cover up what you've done with a secret, and then you have to just tell a bigger and bigger secret, and the situation becomes a lot worse than what it was originally. And then also the crime element of it as well, how you can just be in the wrong situation at the wrong time. You're not necessarily evil, but someone pushes you too much or something happens and you just react. And teens do have that, where they will react and not necessarily think of the long-term implications for the rest of your life. Because you're just kind of living in the day, aren't you? Not thinking about, oh, in 15 years' time, this is going to come back or be a big thing for me. And so that's why I personally love your books and love everything to do with that. You've written over 40 novels. What advice would you give to aspiring writers now?
Okay, well, if you want to write a novel, you have to think two things, really. You have to have in your mind the end result of that novel, in other words, a book that's there written by you. But you also have to think about what you're going to do tomorrow to bring about that end result. So what you would probably do is say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to sit down and write for 15 minutes at my computer, and then the next day I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that every day for a year. And then I'm going to have a body of work that is leading towards that novel. Because if you don't think about what am I going to do tomorrow to bring this about, you'll never bring it about. I mean, I've done a lot of teaching of creative writing, and loads of people come to me and say, I've got this brilliant idea for a novel, and they'll say a few things about it, and I'll think, well, that sounds interesting. And I always say to them, so what are you going to do when you get up tomorrow morning to get towards this novel? And they say, oh, well, I'm waiting till I retire, or I'm going. So it's that really. It's about, don't put it off, do it little by little, and don't give up on it.
Because you was working as a teacher, weren't you, whilst you were still writing your first book? You didn't I'm just going to quit my job and then just write and that's it. You were still keeping your job, but also writing at the same time, finding time. How did you find the time to write? Did you write in the evenings or?
No, I was in an extraordinary position. I was in a school that was actually closing, and it was the last year of it being open. So all we had in the school was 40 year 11 students who had to do their exams. And what we did, because we wanted to protect them and make sure they got the best year they could, we had 25 staff. So each of us had about 4 lessons to teach, but we had to be there every day from 9 to 4. So I did my lessons and all my stuff with the student, but I had a lot of free time. So I sat in the English little cupboard area and typed out my first book. And it was a kind of a project to get me through that year. And at the end of that year, I had a body of work, and I was able to shape it and get it right. And then I bought an Amstrad and put it on a word processor. So that's kind of how it started. But it was hard work, but I had the time and I didn't want to sit around in the staff room drinking coffee. I wanted to do something with it.
Yeah. How much planning goes into writing your novels? Do you do a lot of planning beforehand of the whole structure of the story and then write it up, or do you do it as you're going along?
Yeah, I'm mostly a pantser, as they call them. I go by the seat of my pants. I do have an idea for a story. So, for example, with Looking for JJ, I knew I wanted to write a story about a girl who was 17, who had just been released from prison, who had done this terrible thing when she was 10 years old. And so I had an idea that the first few chapters would be about building up her 17-year-old character, and that during those chapters there would be a sort of perceived threat of a detective looking for her. So she wasn't as safe as she thought she was. And then I knew I'd go back in the middle of the book to when she was 10 and describe what happened. But that was all I had at the beginning of Looking for JJ. I had no idea how it was going to end, what was going to happen. I gave her a boyfriend on the first page just because when I was writing it, I thought about it. But that's what usually happens with my books. And they build. I don't want to say they've got a life of their own, because I don't really think they have, but they sort of organically build. And so you get to a certain point, maybe about 2/3 of the way through, and I know then what my ending's going to be. And that hasn't let me down so far. But I never plan an entire book, and I never know what's going to happen at the end. I never even know who's done it until I get a bit further into the book.
Are you working on a book at the moment? Do you write every day?
I do write every day, but for a very little time. I mean, if I've got a commission and I've got a date, then I'll work a bit harder. I've been working on a middle grade book, which is completely different from anything else I've written. It's a kind of Enid Blyton in the apocalypse. Oh, wow. So if that sounds, but I'm also kind of playing around with an idea of an adult crime book, but it's very in its infancy, and I'm sort of edging forward with it and just messing around with it, really. The lockdown hasn't been good for me in terms of writing, because suddenly I'm just in the same position as everybody else.
Yeah.
Whereas when everybody's out at work, I feel like I've got a job, but with everyone at home. So I've been reading masses and really enjoying that. So I hope when this is all over to get back into my swing a bit.
If you could have any of your books turned into a film, what book would you choose?
Well, I wrote a series about 10 years ago called The Murder Notebooks, which was 4 books about 2 teenagers whose parents vanished 5 years before the books start. They just vanished. And so these 4 books are about these 2 teenagers trying to find their parents. It's a crime novels. Each novel's got a standalone crime, but I often thought it would be great to push the whole 4 books into one and tell the story of them trying to find their parents. And because there's such a lot of action in it, I thought it would make a really interesting film. So, well, we live in hope. We always live in hope.
I think Looking for JJ would make a great TV series.
Yes, I think it would. I think the 2 books together, the follow-up book gives a perspective like 2 or 3 years later when she's at university. So you would have something more than just what's in that first book. Yeah. And yes, when you think of that wonderful series that's been on Normal People, everybody loved that, whereas a series about a teenage girl with this terrible past would be a lovely thing. It's a writer's daydream to think about their books being made into programs or plays or whatever. The one thing about this period of isolation is I think people have rediscovered books. Yeah. And if that's the case, then, well, maybe it's not been worth it, of course, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant if people have rediscovered books. But thank you very much for your questions, and thank you for reading my books too.
Oh, I absolutely adore your books. I can't wait to read more because I've only read 6, so I've got loads more to read from you. And to read The Murder Notebooks, that's what I want to read.
I'm looking forward to a haircut soon.
Yeah, when lockdown's over. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.